He was brought in to the SPCA, found as a stray on the road, and he was clearly injured. It was a problem with one of his hind legs, and was found to have a pretty significant injury in his hip joint. In order to maybe facilitate this, we're going to look at a model. This is the pelvis, hip joint here. This would be where the knee is. So this is actually just a portion of the bone structure of the hind end of a dog. Tail would come off here. So what happened was he was almost certainly hit by a car, and he had what's called a traumatic luxation of the hip joint. So the hip is a ball and socket joint here, pretty clearly shown by this little model. And what had happened to him was when he was hit, this ball was actually driven out of its socket and upwards, and so probably came to rest somewhere in this range here, meaning that this whole thing was pulled out of its socket, and that entails tearing a major ligament called the teres ligament, which helps hold it in the socket. It also entails tearing a lot of muscles and a lot of other ligamentous structures that hold that ball in place. So it's an extremely painful injury. And what happens then is with that ball sitting up here, of course, he doesn't have a normal joint on which to walk, so he's essentially carrying that leg around. He would be non-weight bearing. He would be very painful. The surgery involves basically taking off the ball portion of the ball joint here. So if you can imagine that this is a true ball and socket joint that fits like that, then in order to deal with this so that he can actually manage, the ball portion of the top of that bone is removed, and now you no longer have anything that's going to be sitting in that socket. The bone is obviously repositioned down into its more normal position. The ball is removed. The reality is at the end of this, he forms something called a false joint or a pseudo joint in there. So you don't have the bone in the socket anymore. You have the head of the femur being gone. You have the top of the femur now sitting here in the soft tissues, and it forms something called a pseudo joint or a false joint. Those dogs, if they're fairly light and fairly athletic and have no other major orthopedic issues on other limbs, tend to actually do really well. So I have no doubt that he's going to be running and charging around and jumping in the course of a few months. So that's actually really a good news story for Blake, and I think hopefully represents a big part of what our mandate here is to do, which is not to sort of give up on these guys just because they have an injury or a problem. Really, I guess our underlying concept here is that we're willing to help out pretty much whatever comes through the door. And so just because an animal shows up with a significant injury doesn't doom him to be euthanized. It was done by a surgeon in Calgary, and we were lucky, in fact, to have those people give us a very good deal on that. This is a surgery that probably would typically run in the range of, I would say probably in the range of about $3,000 when done by a surgeon of that caliber, and I think it ended up being done for less than half of that. The time frame for healing on something like this is probably going to be in the range of 8 or 10 weeks. He may not need to be with us for that entire time during that convalescence and recovery period, but he's going to be now an adoptable dog. This should really be the end of the problem for him. He is not probably going to be considered a perfectly normal dog conformationally. So in 5 years, if we were to look at him, he's probably going to be walking with maybe a slightly different gait than you'd be used to seeing on a dog of similar age and size who had been through this. But the reality is that he should be non-painful, he should be ambulatory, and he should be able to run and jump and do almost all those things that he would have been able to do had he not been injured. Another option at that point would have been to amputate the limb, the affected limb. And it's always better for them to be tearing around on 4 if possible. I think that that was something that all of us as a board and all those veterinarians involved would have preferred not to do. If you can leave them intact in the way they were made, then I think that that's ideal. The concept with our SPCA here is that we really believe that these animals do have value, and that they're not to be considered to be just a problem to be gotten rid of, but hopefully that are animals to be hopefully turned around to some degree, either behaviorally if they have problems, or certainly medically if there are fixable problems. And we would generally want to step up, try and fix what's wrong, and then rehome them. So I would hope that other shelters would behave similarly in given the same set of circumstances. I guess I'm afraid that that's probably not, generally speaking, true. My experience in being involved in that kind of business, this dog would not have survived.